Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful. Hello, welcome to Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. It is Monday, November 24th, 2025, and today we are talking about intersex rights and wellness. We have the privilege of having human rights defender Kimberly Zieselman and psychological scientist Dr. Peter Hegarty on our show today. Kimberly Zieselman is Senior Advisor for Global Intersex Rights at Outright International, focused on global movement building and advancing the human rights of intersex people through awareness raising, law, and policy initiatives. Kimberly previously served as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy to Advance Human Rights of LGBTQI+ persons at the U.S. State Department, as well as Executive Director of Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth, the premier U.S. intersex organization, and served on the board of the Interconnect Support Group. Kimberly is a published author, having published XOXY, an award-winning memoir about her personal and professional intersex journey, and she has executive produced the award-winning short intersex film Common as Red Hair. She lives with her husband and daughter in Vermont, United States. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And then we have Dr. Peter Hegarty, who is professor of psychology at Open University in the UK. He has researched everyday sense-making and understanding of variations in sex characteristics among families with lived experience, their healthcare providers, and members of the general public in psychology textbooks. He works with the UK charity Interconnected UK and the American Psychological Association Task Force on Differences of Sex Development. Finally, he directs the steering group of the Psychosocial Studies of Intersex International Network. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Asia.
So we'll go ahead and get started with our human rights defender, as we always do, recognizing, too, that our human rights defenders are often scholars, and our scholars are human rights defenders. And those are not exclusive categories. But Kimberly, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in work on intersex rights and wellness?
Sure. I'd be happy to. And I always like to start off sharing a definition of intersex to make sure that everyone is grounded in the same understanding, because there's still a lot of uncertainty and lack of knowledge around what intersex really means. So the most common definition of intersex is a very large umbrella term that describes someone who has innate variations of sex anatomy or sex characteristics that don't typically line up with what we think of as either a female or a male body. So when I talk about sex characteristics, I'm talking about things like internal reproductive organs, external genitals, chromosomal patterns, hormone levels, and usually an intersex person has one or a variety of these intersex traits that make them intersex. I think it's also important to note up front that not all people who meet that definition of intersex choose to identify with that label. Intersex truly is a physical state of being. For some people, it's also an identity, but it really isn't a gender identity, nor, of course, is it a sexual orientation. Intersex people have all sorts of gender identities and sexual orientations. It is about 1.7% of the population, which isn't actually that rare. It's as common as red hair or green eyes. It's more common than the birth of identical twins. And if you took all the intersex people, estimated number of intersex people, and put them in one place, it would be about the same as the population of either Japan or Mexico. So we're not really that rare, but most people still don't know what intersex is. And I often get asked, like, why is that, right? Like, to sum it up, it's largely due to invisibility based on shame, caused by shame and stigma and actual erasure. So most intersex people, I think I can say, although I don't have data to back this up, are not out. as an intersex person are not sharing their private information or their personal information about their body or their intersex status. And so many are still kind of living quietly, passing and not sharing their intersex stories. And so the number of intersex people actually is a lot greater than most people think. One of the most common human rights violations that our global movement fights back against is the medical erasure, essentially, of intersex bodies, meaning non-consensual interventions, interventions, and other harmful medical practices done to intersex people as minors, often as infants. So before they even have a voice to share what they would like their body to be, to share what their gender identity is, to share what their sexual orientation is. There also are incidences of infanticide in some parts of the world still today, where intersex babies that are born with visible differences. Of course, the physical traits aren't always visible upon birth, but when they are, sadly, in some rural parts of Africa and Asia and elsewhere, infants are actually killed, thought to bring bad luck to the community, and a number of other, misperceptions. So visibility raising and education is really important globally. So whether it's happening, harms are happening in a hospital or they're happening in a remote village somewhere, the most egregious human rights violations are happening as children, as infants and children. But that's not to say that intersex adults don't also suffer from human rights violations. There's certainly incidents of violence. There's incidents of widespread discrimination in many ways. Intersex justice, if you will, to me means visibility and acceptance. It means bodily autonomy. It means health equity and protection from discrimination and violence. My personal story, you asked how I got involved in this. I didn't get involved in this work until about 18 years ago, at around age 40. So I came to this movement late in life, and that was a result of getting my own medical records and discovering the truth about what was done to me as a child without my informed consent and without my parents' true informed consent, by the way. I had surgeries and was lied to about the true nature of those surgeries. And in my situation, and again, intersex is a broad umbrella term. So my personal situation is sadly very, very common. I have one of the more common intersex traits called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. But, this is my story. This is not everyone's story. But I was told, my parents were told that I was born with partially formed female reproductive organs inside that would become cancerous if not removed urgently. So there was a sense of urgency. I hadn't gotten my period at this point. I was a young teen, and that's what prompted, I hadn't gone through puberty, and my younger sister had. And that's what prompted my parents to take me to a Harvard teaching hospital in Boston. And I say that just because I want to make the point that these types of surgeries and harms that I'm going to talk more about, and Peter will talk about, are still happening today in places like, New York, Boston, and all London, all around the globe. Teaching hospitals at this academic centers of excellence. This is not just something that's happening, kind of in rural areas or smaller places. So I think it's really important to know that this is a widespread problem that's still happening. I was rushed to surgery and had, my what I now know are internal healthy testes removed. I learned that 25 years later when I got my medical records. And that, in fact, I never had any internal female reproductive organs. And in fact, my chromosomes are XY and not XX, which is typically what you think of as female. So they removed my healthy functioning gonads, which were producing androgens and testosterone, that for my condition, androgen insensitivity syndrome, I was insensitive to those androgens. I was unable to process them. The body does this really cool thing though called aromatization, and that's about as medical as I'm going to get, but it aromatizes the hormones into type of estrogen, which is something my body did respond to, which is why I also feminized and appeared female and appear female on the outside. And so they removed those healthy functioning gonads that I really needed. I really needed that estrogen, of course. And I've had to be put on, I guess, hormone replacement therapy is the best word for it, since I was a child. The doctors also wanted to create a larger, longer vaginal canal in my body. And the reason that they gave me and my parents as a young 15-year-old was so I could have sex with my husband someday. And this is a really, really common narrative. And, it also kind of underscores the patriarchal kind of binary heteronormative influences that are behind these surgeries. I think it's important to realize. So I was given my prescription for hormone replacement therapy, told to keep this a secret and to have a nice life, basically. By the time I learned the truth, I already had a law degree. I had a career in health policy and advocacy, coincidentally. Even worked at Children's Hospital Boston doing government relations and advocacy for a number of years. And that's a hospital where these harmful surgeries are happening. And I had no idea that it applied to me, nor did I know that they were happening in the hospital that I was advocating for. And by the time I learned all of this, I was happily married and had adopted twin girls from China because, of course, I can't have children. I first got involved in the education and support group space. That was really what was the most important to me, to find others who were like me and had similar experiences. That was life changing and life saving. I always say, no offense to the psychiatrists and therapists and social workers listening, the best thing someone can do for themselves beyond therapy or medication is find others with a common experience. That peer support is absolutely life changing. And that applies to parents too, because I also just want to make a quick nod to the parents. This is happening to the family, right? These situations. And so families getting the right information to make informed decisions and support their children and support themselves through the journey is super important. And I eventually joined Interact, which is a policy and advocacy organization that has a mission of lifting up youth voices, young voices to speak out and change medical practice. That's how I got into this work rather late in life.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. You've spoken to how common it is to be intersex, but how we don't know about this because of stigma, erasure, infanticide, medical malpractice that's a function of patriarchy and heteronormativity, and also maybe just lack of knowledge. I mean, I can tell you, I've never had any chromosomal analysis myself. So there may be people, you tell me, who go their whole lives without knowing.
That's right. There are. Absolutely. It happens.
Well, we're glad to know you. And Peter, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in intersex rights and well-being?
Okay, very different. I think, well, first of all, I should say I am an endosex person, which is a relatively recent term that we have access to, which is nice, which we didn't have a complementary term to intersex until recently. So it's nice. I think that undoes some of the marking. So there were medical emergencies in my infancy, but they had nothing to do with my sex development or anything like that. They were such that they suggested that I might have intellectual disabilities, which I don't particularly have or anything like that. And when I was graduating college at the age of 24, I felt like my mother kind of said, I'm so glad you're graduating college and you've done this thing because, and I realized it's something I took to this work because, or something I rethought as a result of the intersex work would be better to say it, is, how much parents carry. Do you know what I mean? How much kind of concern and how long that is and how you don't appreciate that when you're your own person actually at all. I certainly had no understanding of what my mother was talking about when I was finishing college in my early 20s. I have maybe some sense of it now, 30 years on. I went to the States. I was doing a PhD in the 90s. I was writing about the social psychology of claims that were being made at the time that sexual orientation had a genetic basis or a basis in the brain and things like that. I was interested in the politics of those claims, and some of those arguments were rooted through studies of people with variations, particularly women and girls with a variation called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, because a medical school invited me to talk about that and also invited Bo Laurent, Cheryl Chase, to talk on the same series. I met them. And I had been aware of their work and of the sort of rise of that first wave of intersex activism in the late 90s, just through some kind of queer connections in the Bay Area at the time. So we wrote a paper together. I didn't do much in this, I suppose, at the time because I was sort of establishing my career. And when I moved back to Europe, when I moved to London, I connected with the people in University College London Hospital. And that was a relatively unique group who had, in the late 90s, set up a centre for multidisciplinary care for adolescent and adult women. One of the things I think that is worth really kind of pulling out from your story, Kim, was that sort of thing of once you get out of pediatric care, it's like, okay, that's great, we're done now, off you go.
Right.
Best of luck to you. And the UCLH clinic was one response to that problem, try and, follow people up. So they did a number of innovative studies that sort of documented some of the harms of early interventions on infants and were able to do that, I think, because they had access to adult women. So anyway, God, this has been for a while it was sort of a slow, steady burn in what I was doing. I was always kind of thinking about it in one way or the other. And structures like groups that were set up in the UK were kind of in some ways very intersex grounded in ways that people have sort of forgotten. So for about 20 years here around London, there was a thing called the Critical Sexology Network. And they would every 3 months they would have like a 1 day seminar and they had no money and they just pulled it together. But they were always really interdisciplinary and always really fun. Maybe about 50, 60 people came to them. And that all started from the work of Lee Mei Lau, who was the clinical psychologist in that team, and an author called Ian Morland, who does have variations and was kind of working in critical theory at the time. So I kind of fell into that world and did lots of stuff. I suppose, again, relative to the sort of patriarchal, heteronormative kind of things as well, I don't think I've told you this story, Kim, is early on in that process, the people in UCLH invited me in to observe their clinic. So I think I observed about half a dozen sort of interactions with patients that afternoon. And one of them was this young girl. I mean, she must have been 12, 13, and she was discovering that she had AIS in this
Mm.
encounter. I was sort of with this, what seemed like a really large group of trainee doctors, who were observing this encounter. And I was just,
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm going to do this. But like, I just know, like, there shouldn't be another male body in this room when this girl is going through this.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Yeah.
all I know. And I kind of recoiled from that. And it took me a long time to figure out kind of how do I do something useful and ethical here. I don't know that I've answered that question. But I suppose three things that I have done with that group and with Katrina Rowan and Tuva Lundberg, we did a lot of qualitative studies interviewing young people with variations, their parents and carers, expert healthcare providers, and then some work with the general public. And that was very collaborative work. I didn't do any of those interviews. It really would not have made sense for a man to do those interviews in lots and lots of ways and lots of contexts. So I did other things in the research collaboration. And then in doing that, because I'm always a bit of a historian, I was kind of thinking like, what's the history of these medical practices? And I couldn't find anything on it. So I began researching that with David Griffiths. And then also, as we went into it, I got more and more interested in the question of sort of public understanding and began to see that, a lot of the surgeries are the original rationale for the surgeries in the 50s and continuing was sort of the idea that a person born with variations can't live in our society with their naturally occurring body, right? That's not a feasible life. And particularly, I think there's a lot of harmful assumptions in John Money that such a person can't be loved by their parents, can't be loved by themselves, can't be loved by their society. That's all kind of built into the medical protocol, those assumptions, which are quite horrible, really. So I began to see, well, nobody has studied stigmatization here, and actually maybe that's an expression of the stigmatization that nobody has studied. And I thought, well, actually, this is actually my skill set as a social psychologist. So I set about kind of doing that about 10 years ago, kind of around the time we met at the Surrey conference.
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
starting to do that stuff about then, yeah. So that's how I got into it, and it's just kind of spiraled ever since. But I think for me, there's sort of two things that I've really, really gotten out of being in the intersex world, which I really, really like as a psychologist. And one is I'm challenged to be very interdisciplinary. We have an event in PSII this week, which is all about intersex in Christian and Islamic tradition. So, that's just I was
Hmm.
raised in one of those. I know very little about the other, so that's just you. But these are really important aspects of people's being. Do you know what I mean? And I think behavioral and brain sciences and medicine can chop people up into parts, and that can be dehumanizing. So there's something I like about this world where we're forced to put people back together in our minds and maybe in our hearts as well. And then there's something also I like the other thing I really resonated with in your story, Kim, was when you said like I didn't get into this till 40. And there's so many people that I know in the in the intersex world are doing this in their 40s and their 50s and so on. And I spent a lot of time in LGBT, and I feel like a really old man in LGBT. You know, I feel like I'm in the wrong cohort. I don't have the right language. I don't have shared experiences with people. There's ageism, there's all sorts of things. Whereas in
Hmm.
the intersex world, I find I'm hanging with people and we're talking about health and we're talking about like when are you going to retire? And people are talking about grown-up children and their dogs. And it feels like a sort of movement that has a lot of people that are sort of in midlife in it, whereas LGBT feels very young. So those are unexpected things where I have found a lot of home in the intersex world, even though I am, just
Interesting. Yeah.
random endosex bloke who happened to end up here.
No, I wouldn't call you a random interest endosex bloke. No, no, your involvement is very intentional and much appreciated. Yeah, no, a lot of what you said resonates with me, from my vantage point, and particularly thinking about my own experience with mental health. And, I write about this a lot in my book. It's really where I first talked about it publicly around what I now know was disassociation that I was doing,
Yeah,
particularly mostly in young adulthood. And realizing, looking back, that I had my brain and body had learned how to cope and survive by just pushing away thoughts, and actually to the point where any heightened emotion, negative or even really positive, like when my husband proposed to me, or when I met my adopted daughters in the
yeah,
Chinese orphanage for the first time, I blank out. And I realize it afterwards that I know something just happened and I've missed it.
yeah,
And so that's a negative impact, right? Of course, that's sort of what I've written about in the past, that I call the invisible harm
yeah,
that was done to me. We can talk about losing your gonads, hormone replacement therapy, the effects of surgery, even the effects of having, a number of medical residents, mostly male, come into the post-surgical, room and lift up the sheet and have another doctor describe the work that was done. I mean, this is again very common narrative, and
yeah,
all of those have had impacts. But the invisible harm is really, I think, the harm that and I'm sure other people with similar experiences have carried on through life.
mm,
Um, and to me, that is one of the things I would really like to see, ideally in my lifetime, if possible. Um, Addressed by the mental health professionals, whether it's research or coming up with best practice. I mean, obviously the trauma informed care is right at the core of this. um, but I just wanted to make a plug for that. And as you said and I referenced earlier, the medical community tends to just kind of jump on this as a problem to fix when we are children and infants and children. But then once we get into our 20s, there's just a huge gap. And this isn't just in the United States. I think this exists
oh, I
globally.
think
I
so.
know it
Yeah,
exists globally,
yeah, yeah,
where there's a lack of gender affirming, intersex competent care, whether it's mental health care or physical care. So, I mean, that's a huge disservice and a huge health inequity that I think our community struggles with, whether or not they've had non-consensual interventions in their youth. But particularly if they have, it becomes very complicated. And so that's my little pitch for developing those, best practices.
definitely. And I mean, I think one of the things I've kind of been concerned about in the last 10 years, and I've kind of said this in various places, is let's take the big surgery debate, for example, like on both sides of that, human rights defenders like yourself, Kimberly, or people who might be saying, oh, surgery is getting better, we simply have to
Mm,
just keep getting better surgery. Everybody on both sides is saying, and we need more psychology, right? However,
yeah.
if I kind of turn that lens around and look at psychology, there aren't best practice guidelines. There isn't knowledge. There is now, I think, a very nice body of lots and lots of small qualitative studies on people with variations, their experience of healthcare. They've been done in multiple countries, that all needs to be sort of brought together and can be used, I think, to develop clinical guidelines and best practice guidelines. And I think resources that you would have, particularly in the States around kind of multicultural guidelines, would be very germane to that project and could be really
Hmm.
usefully brought to bear on that kind of a project. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, you wouldn't sort of say if somebody had variations and they had experienced trauma and dissociation and those things that you were talking about, oh, go to your local psychologist. That will definitely be a good intervention. And and I know people who have done that, and it has been a good intervention, and people for whom it really has not been a good intervention at all. They've
Right.
ended up spending money teaching their psychotherapist about intersex or
Oh,
something.
always. Yeah.
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 So yeah, I think a lot is demanded of psychology. There's an image that psychology can solve all of these problems, which is a bit of a problem. And psychology at this point in its history is not there ready to deliver on those promises. All of this, I think, is also to when you were talking about peer support and saying, yeah, I was like, no, you're not going to get any resistance from me, Kim. That peer support is probably more important than a psychologist. And
Right. Right. You've seen that. I mean, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. The group I work with here in the UK are called Interconnected.
Hmm.
And so many intersex groups ha use some version of that, like connect, interconnect.
Hmm.
There's lots of projects and groups that have that kind, use that kind of word, and I think that really it speaks to the sort of importance of that, the desire for that, and the lived experience of that just being really, really just so changing people so much when they can access it. People
Absolutely.
telling their stories is just massive,
Hmm.
absolutely.
It
Yeah.
sounds like, Peter, we don't have best practices yet, but Kimberly's mentioned some generic best practices like gender affirming care and trauma informed care
Yeah,
and
yeah.
community supports. But what do you said there's a handful of qualitative studies that give us a little bit of understanding about what best practices could look like. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, I mean, after that first wave of activism in the 90s, when Bolaront and ISNA kind of, really raised this issue, I suppose, there was a bit of retraction. So I think medicine tried to gain control in response to that and the findings about scientific fraud in John Money's work as well, which are really quite shocking.
Hmm.
And there was a thing called the Chicago Consensus Statement, which tried to put things on a new kind of bioethical footing. Promised a lot, but I think since then, since 2006, I think a lot of qualitative researchers in psychology and health communication and sociology and fields like that have been trying to answer the question, what if anything has actually changed in medical practice? Do you know what I mean?
20 years later. Yeah.
I think what we can see is that there are new norms, but the practices are not shifting. So
Hmm.
in our research, I'm thinking of papers that have been led now by my colleague Katrina Ruin rather than myself. But, so there's a norm to do a lot more disclosure to young people about their variations. But what that can translate into is the clinician saying to the parent, okay, go away and do some disclosure. The parent saying, oh, yes, like, kind of going with the medical authority in the room and then kind of going away and saying, oh my God, like, how am I going to talk to my daughter about this? This is a
Hmm.
hard thing for parents to talk about, genitals
Hmm.
and bodies with kids at the best of times, but this is really, really a tough one. And there isn't support and there aren't scripts and, all the rest of it. So then a clinician may assume disclosure has happened when it hasn't. So disclosure happens inadvertently and in awful medical language in a 6-minute medical encounter. So, that's kind of what I
Right.
mean. You know what I mean? It's like we've changed the
Yeah.
norms, but we haven't actually put a set of new grounded practices always in place that one
Right.
could rely upon. And as a result, it's still like super, super, super risky. Even putting to aside as you say, putting aside the physical stuff, the psychosocial
Right.
stuff is still risky.
But that's so true. I mean, I'm a parent. My daughters are now, the twins are now 24 years old. But you mentioned, you alluded to some issues that you had as a child. My children have had, learning differences and different things that I've had to advocate for as a parent. And so I think, as a side note, I think there's a lot of similarity when we're
Mm,
talking about intersex issues, parental children's consent, and these dynamics to what we know as a disability rights community, right? And
yeah.
I don't think there's enough interplay there, and that's something else I'd really like to see more cross movement collaboration because queer, if you will, communities. Whether they're funders, whether they're organizations, whether they're just allies, smart allies, have been integral to the intersex movement,
Mm,
so-called intersex movement over the last 2 decades. And also, that's not enough.
yeah.
We need, cross collaboration to bring allyship resources and, you know, brilliance from all different communities, including reproductive justice. I think we
Mm,
could learn a lot from
yeah,
the anti-FGM movement and so on and so on. So yeah, I think these more cross-movement collaboration, it's sort of akin to like the interdisciplinary model, but on a much larger
yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah,
movement
yeah,
scale,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And as you say, there some of the norms and some of the thinking and some of the kind of accepted best practices in theory are being established, yet they're not put into place. And I think you're absolutely right. Like I was alluding to myself as a parent, I think parents need that scaffolding and those instructions or those guides, let's call them guides, that don't necessarily exist. And I think all of this goes back to now putting on my activism practical hat. What does it come back to? It's not because intersex people and parents aren't talking about it. I mean, we all have these ideas. We all know what we need.
mm,
We have allied professionals like you, Peter. You know what needs to be done. It comes down to a lack of resources.
mm,
There are just not enough. There's no resource available, very little resource available for this work, whether you're talking about academic research, whether you're talking about advocacy and policy, whether you're talking about, supporting families. What I've witnessed mostly in the US, because that's where I'm based over the years, is yes, there's multidisciplinary care centers of excellence, quote unquote, across the US. And technically, they list having psychosocial supports of different
yeah,
disciplines involved. But guess what? They're barely involved, if involved. And also, they are not money makers. And here in the United States, it's the nonprofit medical industrial complex, right?
yeah,
It's like
yeah, absolutely.
healthcare is a business here in the United States, and I wonder how this translates like to the UK and other places where it's government sponsored, more quote unquote socialized medicine. Because here
Mm,
in the US, I find that the business of a DSD, difference of sex development
yeah,
clinic, is driving some of these decisions. Like surgeons are going to bring in a lot more money than social workers. And
yeah.
so, how do we tackle that? How do we tackle that?
I mean, it does transfer here. We do have a big National Health Service, which is a national treasure. I can't tell you how much it's considered a national treasure here. But of course, there's a huge amount of health economics thinking that goes into a system that big as well. So some
Mm,
of the pressures
mhm,
are very much there. I mean, some of what you're saying, I think, really does translate over here. So there was a study by Faye Garland at the University of Manchester and her colleagues a few years ago. They did a Freedom of Information Act study looking at record keeping around variations and who was in the multidisciplinary teams in the specialist DSD clinics. I think it was just England. I think it might have been England it was. I think it was just England. But the Chicago consensus statement is quite clear, and the follow-up stuff is quite clear that medical care is only ever bioethically viable if you do have a mental health person on that multidisciplinary team. You've got to have either a psychologist or a psychiatrist on that team, and that was not in place across the UK NHS. So it was not in place, for example, in the northeast of England where I am today. There's some great psychologists in those DST teams, some of whom but it wasn't, it certainly was not consistent. So it was still quite risky. And then the other thing was that record keeping was incredibly variable and incredibly unsystematic. And so it would be very hard to know how many kids with AIS were born in the UK in a given year or anything like that that one might want to know for,
that's
statistical
right.
reasons or research reasons. So that definitely does translate. But yeah, I mean, I think we have to turn the lens back on psychology because I think what I've become more and more aware of is, and more concerned about, I suppose, and maybe, I've become quieter because of this, but I think we
Mm,
spend a lot of time talking about how medical doctors put their own professional interests ahead of, the people who are positioned as their patients, in this world. And I'm
mm,
just kind of increasingly concerned about psychologists, both those who are kind of practicing mental health and those of us who are researchers, also unconsciously doing that. Do you know what I
mhm.
mean? We were at a conference in the summer, an academic conference, Kimberly, and I was.
Right.
There were some people who were complaining about that, about the academics, and I thought, well, yeah, I think you really have a point. Actually, I think you've got a
Mhm.
point. I
I mean, I
just,
think that just goes to the humanness of us all, like we all have egos,
yeah, we
we've all
do.
been trained in our different disciplines. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's easy. I empathy for that to some degree, as much as I could be a, angry activist. I have empathy for that because it's
Yeah,
what you're, and I do think also, even the doctors really are trying to do what they think is best. I mean, that, at the core is we're not
yeah,
talking about this is what's so tricky, I think, about the work we're doing, like
yeah,
we're not talking about in 99.9% of the cases, I'll leave a little room where medics are going around trying to cause harm or have evil intent.
yeah,
I just,
yeah,
it can feel like that as an intersex person who's been harmed, and I, am validating all of those feelings to my peers. And also, after doing this for almost a couple of decades, I have seen both attempts at, I've been a part of both attempts to work with medical, institutions and people who are humans with egos and institutions that have business motives, et cetera, as well as, file lawsuits and protest outside of hospital, and unfortunately, I think the lawsuits and the protests, while not as effective as I'd like them to be, have been more effective than the
yeah, yeah,
collaborative approach, which is, despite being a lawyer and an activist, that is not my nature. I would much rather, work with,
yeah,
to solve a problem. And then, of course, that gets complicated depending on the cultural and political context you're in. But like right now, here we are in the United States
yeah,
with a horrible fascist, I'll just say that out loud, administration, and all of the horrible things that that means trickle down to everything, including intersex activism. And, I feel like voices have been quelched. And this is just, here in the US. And again, I work globally, but focusing on the US, I think activists are really struggling to like have a voice, and kind of figure out the strategy in this moment in time because it's so volatile.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
we face a lot of challenges.
yeah.
um, it really is a complicated movement. Sometimes I'm like, why did I choose to get involved in this? There's so many other things I could have done. This is not easy, which
It-
probably is part of its appeal, to
But
be
you know,
honest.
the other thing that I kind of felt at that conference, this was a large conference in Dublin City University that was primarily by Marta Prandelli, who is a wonderful
Hmm.
career researcher in this area, was, being in a room of, 150 people who were all doing this stuff, some of those plenary sessions, for example, I just did really have a sense of like, oh, there is just an awful lot of good people working on this problem from
Hmm.
an
Hmm.
awful lot of different vantage points in an awful lot of different countries, bringing an awful lot of different skills to it. That also being a kind of shared storytelling. Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
changes your perspective on reality and what's possible. But
That's
yeah,
right. And I think it goes back to resources for me. Like the
yeah,
people are there, the will is there, the brains and the hearts are there. It's a commitment to, all of this takes money and time and coordination, so that's my hope for the movement is that we can become a little bit more coordinated and better resourced because there's huge potential for positive change.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think huge benefits for endosex people in this movement succeeding.
Hmm.
Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? It's
it's a
it
win-win.
it's a
Hmm.
win-win, it's
Hmm.
a win-win. So in the same way, I'm a man who's been around kind of feminist psychology for a long time, and there's all sorts of ways that's been very, very useful. But in the same way, I think, a conversation I keep having with intersex folks who are in this space is, what is the thing in your life that you're like really rethinking as a result of, hanging out with intersex folks and intersex
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
and people have very different answers to that question, depending on their culture or their family circumstances or medicine. But people have a lot of answers. Do you know what I mean? Endosex folks in this space have an awful lot of answers to that question. So I just
Mm,
think sometimes this can be framed as this is being done for intersex people, and of course it is.
yeah,
But
but I see what you're saying.
that's not the
Hmm.
totality of this. There's more to it than that, I think, as well. It's like this should change the way we think about bodies and harm and the relationship between privacy and secrecy and things that
Yes,
matter to everybody, no matter what your body might be like.
I would like to see that paper.
Okay, let's write that one.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Peter has his marching orders, and Kimberly and Peter, you've both given us time, energy, your humanity today. Thank you for everything that you're doing to defend human rights for those who are intersex and for all people. It's been a privilege to have you on.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.